The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the bustling grocery store parking lot. Officer Bradley Monroe, a 15-year veteran of the force, leaned against his patrol car, scanning the area with sharp, judgmental eyes. His presence wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about control. Bradley had a reputation. His so-called proactive policing often meant targeting people who didn't fit his idea of belonging. And today, his focus locked onto a black woman sitting casually on the hood of a sleek black sedan. She was on the phone, laughing, completely at ease. Too comfortable, Bradley thought. Too confident. Something about her irritated him. Maybe it was the way she held herself, unbothered, self-assured, as if she owned the space. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't intimidated. That alone was enough to make her suspicious in his eyes. Bradley adjusted his belt, straightened his badge, and started toward her. Time to remind her who's in charge. She noticed him immediately, but didn't react. Instead, she kept talking, nodding along to whatever was being said on the other end. Bradley's jaw tightened, the disrespect. "Excuse me," he said, voice dripping with authority. "I need to see some ID." The woman arched an eyebrow, barely sparing him a glance. "I'm on the phone," she said coolly. Bradley's patience was already thin. "I don't care. You're loitering on private property. ID. Now." She sighed, then ended her call. Slowly, she turned to face him fully. There was something in her eyes, something unsettling. "I don't think you know who you're talking to," she said. Bradley smirked. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to. A woman who's about to have a problem." He had no idea. Bradley crossed his arms, his stance widening. He was used to people backing down when confronted, especially when he pressed them hard enough. But this woman, she wasn't budging. She held his gaze, calm and unreadable. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Bradley said, his voice sharpening. "Give me your ID, or I'll place you under arrest for obstruction." A slow smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Obstruction of what exactly?" Bradley's temper flared. "You're refusing to comply with a lawful order from an officer. That's obstruction." The woman sighed, shaking her head slightly, as if disappointed. "No, officer, that's harassment." A few people had stopped in the parking lot, their eyes darting between the two. The tension in the air was thick, crackling like static before a storm. Bradley was losing patience. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I have a..." The woman raised a single hand, silencing him without a word. "You really don't want to do that." Her voice wasn't loud, but the authority in it stopped him cold. There was something about her, something that made him uneasy. But Bradley wasn't about to back down. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but out here I make the rules." She studied him for a long moment, then, without a hint of fear, she reached into her purse. Bradley's pulse spiked. His hand hovered over his holster, fingers twitching. And then, she pulled it out, a sleek black leather badge wallet. With one flick of her wrist, she flipped it open. Bradley's breath caught. FBI. Not just that. 3 bold words stood out beneath her name. Chief of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Bradley's throat went dry. His eyes darted between the badge and the woman's face, hoping, praying, that this was some kind of joke. It wasn't. FBI chief. The highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the country. A woman he had just threatened with arrest. His entire body tensed as cold panic set in. "You were saying, officer?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was still calm, still controlled, but now it carried an unmistakable weight. Bradley's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to salvage the situation. I didn't realize." She snapped the badge wallet shut. "No, you didn't." Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. People in the parking lot were still watching, their curiosity turning into realization. Murmurs spread. A few even pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Bradley's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just an uncomfortable situation. This was career-ending. "Ma'am, I was just following protocol," he stammered. "You have to understand." "No," she cut him off. "What I understand is that you made an assumption, one that you had no legal grounds for." She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Bradley, for the first time in his career, stepped back. "I've spent years fighting against the very kind of policing you just displayed," she continued. "Targeting someone based on appearance, throwing around authority like a weapon." Bradley's jaw clenched. "I wasn't profiling." "Then why did you approach me?" she asked, her eyes locked onto his. What crime was I committing? Bradley had no answer, and they both knew it. He was done. Bradley's entire body felt like it was on fire. He could feel the stares, the judgment, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him like a collapsing building. His mind scrambled for a way out. Damage control. He needed to flip this. Look, he said, forcing a tight smile. This is just a misunderstanding. If you felt disrespected, I apologize. The FBI chief didn't blink. A misunderstanding? She repeated. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the force of a hammer striking steel. Yes, Bradley said quickly, trying to regain control. I was just doing my job. You know how it is, keeping the community safe, making sure everything is in order. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Safe, she echoed. Tell me, Officer Monroe, who exactly was unsafe in this situation? Bradley swallowed hard. He knew he was in deep, but he wasn't about to admit fault. I was just making sure you weren't. Weren't what? She interrupted. The silence stretched. Then she pulled out her phone. Bradley's stomach dropped. Let's see what your department thinks about this, she said, scrolling through her contacts. Bradley took a step forward, panic rising in his chest. Wait, there's no need for that. Oh, there's every need. She pressed the call button. Bradley could barely breathe. His entire career was hanging by a thread, and the woman he had just harassed, she was about to cut it. Bradley stood frozen, watching the FBI chief hold the phone to her ear. His mouth felt dry, his hands clammy. Every instinct screamed at him to fix this before it was too late. Ma'am, please, he blurted out. There's no need to escalate this, let's just talk. She raised a single finger, silencing him as the line connected. Director Marsh, this is FBI Chief Olivia Carter, she said smoothly. Bradley's stomach dropped. She wasn't just making a complaint, she was going straight to the top. I need an immediate review of an incident involving one of your officers, Officer Bradley Monroe, she continued. I'd like internal affairs to be looped in as well. Bradley felt his knees weaken. Internal affairs. 2 words that spelled disaster for any cop. The person on the other end responded, their voice too low for Bradley to hear. But whatever they said made Chief Carter nod. Yes, I'll be submitting a formal statement, but I'd also suggest you check his past stops and complaints. I have a feeling this isn't his first overreach. Bradley's chest tightened. She was digging. If they started pulling records, they'd find things. Small complaints that had been brushed aside, a pattern he had always ignored because he never thought it would catch up to him. Understood? Carter said, finishing the call, I'll expect an update soon. She ended the call and looked up at Bradley. You just made the biggest mistake of your career, she said plainly. Bradley opened his mouth, but no words came, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. Bradley felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. His entire career, his power, his authority was slipping through his fingers like sand. He needed to act fast. Chief Carter, he started, forcing his voice to stay steady. Let's be reasonable here. We're both in law enforcement. We know how these things go. Her expression didn't change. How exactly do they go, Officer Monroe? Bradley exhaled sharply, scrambling for an angle. Come on, you know how intense things can get out here. We have to be vigilant. There are real threats. I was just doing my job. Carter studied him for a long moment. Your job, she repeated, her voice dangerously low. Tell me, Officer Monroe, what was the threat? Bradley hesitated. He couldn't say because you were black. He couldn't say because you looked too confident. He couldn't say because I wanted to show you who's in charge. Because now, he wasn't. She took a step closer, and instinctively, he stepped back. You profiled me, she said plainly. You assumed something about me based on my appearance, and now that you realize who I am, you're scrambling to justify it. Bradley opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Carter glanced at the people still recording. Unfortunately for you, officer, this moment is going to live forever. Bradley's stomach twisted. This wasn't going away, and for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Bradley stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, every ounce of control he had over the situation slipping away. The people in the parking lot were still watching, some of them murmuring, some still recording. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment, it was a public execution of his career. Carter remained calm, unfazed by the crowd or the spectacle unfolding. She took a deep breath and finally spoke again. "I'm done here, officer. I've got a phone call to make." With that, she turned and walked away without another word, leaving Bradley standing in the middle of the parking lot, the eyes of every person present locked on him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a constant reminder that this wasn't over. "Bradley Monroe," he answered, trying to steady his voice. "It's Mitchell," came the voice on the other end, the tone colder than Bradley had ever heard. "You better get to the station now." "Mitchell, No excuses." Mitchell cut him off. "This is bad. You're in serious trouble." The phone clicked off, and Bradley's heart dropped to his stomach. The weight of what he had just done was starting to settle in. The entire department would know by now. Internal affairs. The media. This wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. He looked back in the direction Carter had gone, but she was already gone, leaving him to face the inevitable consequences of his actions. Bradley slowly walked to his patrol car, each step heavier than the last. His badge, once a symbol of authority and respect, felt like a weight on his chest. He had crossed a line, and now he would have to pay. By the time Bradley arrived at the station, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual chatter in the bullpen was replaced by a tense silence. His colleagues avoided his eyes as he walked in, the weight of what had happened still hanging in the air. He could feel it, the judgment. "Monroe," his sergeant barked, motioning for him to come into his office. "Close the door behind you." Bradley did as he was told, his hands shaking slightly as he sat across from his sergeant. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've caused?" Mitchell's voice was low, but it carried a lethal edge. I didn't mean for it to escalate like that," Bradley said, fumbling for an explanation. "It was a mistake. I was doing my job." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "No, you weren't. You were trying to flex your power, and now look at the mess we're in." Bradley swallowed hard. "She's the FBI chief, Mitchell. I didn't know." "Doesn't matter," Mitchell snapped. "You didn't know? That's your defense? You don't get to make assumptions about people like that, especially when they're doing nothing wrong." Bradley bit his lip, guilt gnawing at him. I know I messed up, but you have to understand, I wasn't thinking straight. She was just sitting there, and I thought..." "Enough," Mitchell interrupted. "I don't want to hear it. This is bigger than your damn ego." He reached for the stack of papers on his desk and slid them toward Bradley. "Internal Affairs has already been notified. They're pulling your file, looking into every stop, every report. This isn't just about her. It's about the kind of officer you've been. You're on suspension, Bradley, pending investigation." Bradley's chest tightened as the words sunk in. Suspension. A polite way of saying you're done. He felt the walls closing in on him. "Get out of my office," Mitchell ordered. Bradley didn't need to be told twice. He stood up, his legs unsteady as he left the office. As he walked through the station, the whispers were impossible to ignore. He had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. His career was over, and the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. The news spread faster than Bradley had expected. The incident in the parking lot, the viral video, and the phone call to Internal Affairs made headlines within hours. By the time he arrived home that night, his phone was flooded with messages. Some from family, others from colleagues, and a few from people he didn't even know. The tone of the messages varied, but the underlying sentiment was clear. He was a disgrace. Bradley sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone screen, the gravity of the situation fully setting in. "Racist cop harasses black woman, later revealed to be FBI chief," the headline read. The story was everywhere. Social media was ablaze with outrage, with people calling for justice and accountability. The comments were relentless. Bradley had spent his career building a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense officer. But now that reputation had been shattered. He was no longer a protector of the law. He was the face of a deeper issue that everyone wanted to expose. One message caught his eye. It was from his old partner, Jack. "Bradley, man, I'm sorry, but you're in way over your head now. I don't know what happened out there, but you need to own up to it. This isn't something you can just apologize your way out of." Bradley clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He had no idea how to fix this. His entire life was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He turned off his phone and tossed it onto the bed. The silence in the room was suffocating. a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside in the world. Outside, people were calling for his resignation, demanding that the department take swift action. Community leaders were speaking out and activists were organizing rallies. The situation was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. But as the night wore on, one thing became clear. He couldn't run from what he had done. He had to face the consequences. But what would those consequences be? The next morning, Bradley walked into the Internal Affairs office with a heavy heart. The air felt thick with tension, and every step he took echoed in the sterile hallway. He had never been on this side of the desk before. Officer Turner, a senior investigator, looked up from his desk as Bradley entered. His expression was unreadable, but there was a coldness in his eyes. "Monroe," Turner said, his voice flat. "Sit down." Bradley complied, sinking into the chair across from him. He could feel the weight of the investigation pressing on his shoulders. He had read the reports. He knew what was coming. "I've reviewed the video," Turner said, his tone clinical. "We have multiple witnesses who corroborate that you accosted a civilian for no reason. And not just any civilian, a federal agent." Bradley nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had already admitted to his mistakes, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. "You understand the severity of this situation?" Turner asked. Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I do." Turner leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Do you understand that your actions reflect on the entire department? On every officer who wears this badge? Do you understand the damage you've caused to the trust we've worked so hard to build with the community?" Bradley's eyes dropped to the floor. "Yes," he whispered again. "Good," Turner said, his voice sharp. "Because what happens next is going to determine your future in this department." Bradley felt a cold sweat break out across his back. "What happens next?" Turner's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "We're recommending termination. You will be given a hearing to defend yourself, but given the evidence and the public outcry, it's unlikely you'll keep your job." Bradley felt like the room was closing in on him. Termination. He had worked his entire life to get here, and now it was all slipping away. "You'll be notified of the hearing date," Turner continued. "In the meantime, you're officially on leave. Don't show up at the station. Don't make any public statements. Anything you say will only make it worse." Bradley nodded, his chest tightening. "I understand." As he stood to leave, Turner's voice stopped him. "Monroe," Turner said quietly, almost like an afterthought. "You might want to consider how you're going to handle your reputation. Once this hits the media fully, your life will be a lot different." Bradley didn't respond. He just left. And as he stepped out into the bright daylight, he realized for the first time that there was no going back. Bradley sat at home, his mind racing. The hearing was coming up soon, and the weight of what he had done pressed down on him with each passing minute. It wasn't just about losing his job anymore. It was about his legacy, his reputation, and the fact that he had to face a community that would never look at him the same way again. The media storm had only intensified since his suspension. Headlines were relentless. Online forums buzzed with debates. News anchors discussed the case like it was the final nail in the coffin for police accountability. Bradley watched it all unfold on his television, unable to turn away. The footage of him confronting Chief Carter in the parking lot was being replayed over and over. Each time it aired, the public's anger seemed to grow. His phone rang again, but he didn't answer. He was too afraid to hear what the voice on the other end would say. Instead, he scrolled through social media, reading comment after comment. This cop needs to be fired, plain and simple. He had no right to treat her like that. There's no excuse for this kind of behavior. The system protects people like him. It's time for real change. Bradley felt the walls closing in. The criticism wasn't just coming from strangers anymore. Former colleagues, people he had known and trusted, were voicing their anger. There were petitions circulating to have him removed from the force for good. He couldn't escape it, and just when he thought it couldn't get worse, his phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. "Bradley, I saw what's happening. What the hell is going on? You're going to ruin everything." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill. "I know, Mom. I know. I messed up." "Messed up? You ruined your entire career, Bradley." You've embarrassed our family, and now they're talking about firing you. How are you going to fix this?" Bradley didn't know. For the first time in his life, he had no answers. And as his mother's voice trembled on the other end of the line, Bradley realized that this wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about the kind of person he had become, and the kind of person he still could be. The days leading up to his hearing felt like a slow-motion descent. Bradley couldn't escape the suffocating guilt that clung to him like a second skin. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Carter's calm, unwavering gaze and heard her words echo in his head, "You profiled me." He thought about the community, about the trust he had betrayed, the faces of the people who had looked to him for protection, only to see him abuse his power. The shame was almost unbearable. On the eve of the hearing, Bradley found himself in a small coffee shop, trying to find some semblance of peace before the inevitable. He stared out the window, watching the world go by, but he couldn't focus on anything. His mind kept drifting back to the moment he first approached Carter in the parking lot. What if he had just treated her like any other citizen? What if he hadn't let his biases cloud his judgment? He didn't have those answers. But what he did have was the knowledge that he couldn't go back and change it. The door to the coffee shop opened, and a familiar voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Bradley?" He looked up, surprised to see his old partner, Jack, standing in the doorway. Jack had always been one of the few people who understood the pressures of being a cop, but now things felt different between them. Jack sat down across from him, eyeing him with a mixture of concern and disappointment. "I've been hearing the news," he said quietly. "Man, you really messed up this time." Bradley didn't deny it. He couldn't. "I don't know what to do, Jack," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm about to lose everything. My career, my reputation. I don't even know who I am anymore." Jack sighed and leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You're a cop, Bradley. You always have been. But this isn't just about being a cop. It's about being a man. And right now, you have to decide what kind of man you want to be." Bradley swallowed hard. "I don't even know if I deserve a chance to change." Jack's gaze softened. "Everyone deserves a chance, Bradley, but it's up to you to take it. No one can do that for you." For the first time in days, Bradley felt a flicker of something inside him. Hope? Maybe. But more than that, it was the spark of accountability. He wasn't sure if it would be enough to save his career, but for the first time, he knew that he had to try. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but as he lay in bed that night, one thing was clear. His path forward wasn't just about fixing his mistakes. It was about confronting who he had become and fighting to be better. And that fight was just beginning. Bradley walked into the hearing room with a pounding heart. The atmosphere was formal, almost sterile, and the long table filled with senior officers and legal representatives only made him feel smaller. His lawyer was sitting beside him, but Bradley wasn't sure why. At this point, there was little to defend. Across from him sat members of Internal Affairs, including Turner, who had been leading the investigation into his actions. The air was thick with tension, and Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that he was being judged by everyone in the room, and rightfully so. Turner cleared his throat and glanced at the papers in front of him. "Officer Monroe, you're here today because of your actions on date, where you engaged in a confrontation with an FBI chief in a grocery store parking lot. You were filmed harassing a civilian who later revealed herself to be a federal agent. Do you acknowledge your actions?" Bradley's voice was steady, but his stomach churned. "Yes, I do. I was wrong. There's no excuse for what I did." There was a pause as Turner glanced around the room, clearly unimpressed by Bradley's acknowledgement. "And do you understand," Turner continued, "that this kind of behavior is not only unprofessional, but it's a violation of the public trust? This kind of abuse of power, targeting someone because of their race, is a betrayal of the values this department is supposed to stand for." Bradley's throat tightened. "I understand. I know I've let everyone down." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Everyone seemed to be waiting for him to offer some defense, some justification, but there was none. "You can't just apologize and move on, Monroe," another officer said sharply. "This isn't a minor mistake. This is a career-ending moment." Bradley clenched his fists under the table, fighting the urge to break down. I know. I know it's not enough. I need you to understand that this wasn't me trying to be malicious, but I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's on me." His voice cracked, and he quickly cleared his throat. "Do you think," Turner asked, "that you can change? Do you think that after everything you've done, you're capable of being the officer this department needs?" Bradley swallowed hard. The question hung in the air, and for a moment he couldn't answer. His mind raced. Could he really change? Could he rebuild what he had torn down? He thought about his conversation with Jack. He thought about the people in his community who depended on officers to do the right thing, to protect and serve without prejudice. And for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the badge he had once worn so proudly. "I don't know," Bradley finally admitted, his voice raw. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be better, to earn back that trust. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'll fight for it. I'll fight for change." A murmur rippled through the room. Some seemed skeptical, others seemed surprised, but no one spoke. "Thank you, Officer Monroe," Turner said, his voice cold again. "We will review your statement. The department will make its final decision shortly." Bradley nodded, not sure if his words had made any difference. He stood up slowly, feeling the eyes of the room on him as he walked out. The hearing was over, but his fight was just beginning. The following days felt like an endless stretch of time. Bradley couldn't stop replaying the hearing in his mind. His words had been honest, but were they enough? He wasn't sure. The entire department was waiting for a decision, and the media had only intensified its scrutiny. He couldn't escape the constant stream of messages and news reports. Every new headline seemed to push him further into the shadows of his former life. His phone buzzed on his desk, but Bradley ignored it. He had long stopped answering calls from friends, family, and colleagues. The shame felt suffocating. At the station, the tension was palpable. Officers whispered in hallways, casting sideways glances whenever Bradley passed. Some had already made up their minds, some kept their distance, and a few seemed to show pity that Bradley couldn't stand. He sat in his apartment late one evening, staring at his reflection in the dark window. The man who looked back at him was a stranger. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, felt like a costume. He thought about the people who depended on him, the oath he had sworn to protect and serve. How had he fallen so far from that ideal? The knock on his door startled him. It was his lawyer. "I just got off the phone with Internal Affairs," she said, her voice careful. "They've made a decision. We need to go over the details." Bradley's heart raced. "What's the verdict?" "Not good," she said. "You're being recommended for termination. The department wants to fire you." Bradley's stomach dropped. He had prepared for this, but hearing it aloud made it feel all the more real. "I'm sorry, but it's not just the incident with the FBI agent," his lawyer continued. "The department feels that you've lost the trust of the public and the community. And in light of the media coverage, they're concerned about the damage this has done to the department's reputation." Bradley felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under him. He had known this was coming, but the weight of it hit him harder than he expected. He had failed. There was no coming back from this, not professionally. But his lawyer wasn't finished. "There's still a small window," she said. "The decision is not final yet. You have a chance to appeal, but it's going to take a lot of work. You need to show them you're committed to real change." Bradley stared at her, his mind racing. Appeal? Could he really turn this around? Could he convince anyone that he was worthy of redemption? "I don't know if I can," he muttered, his voice strained. His lawyer's gaze softened. "Bradley, you've made mistakes, but that doesn't mean your career is over. It means you have to fight harder. You have to prove you're willing to do the work, the real work, to make things right." Bradley nodded, feeling a flicker of something in his chest. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe he could still fight for a future. But it would take more than just words this time. It would take actions. The decision was looming over Bradley like a heavy cloud, but he wasn't going to let it consume him. He had been given a second chance, and for the first time in weeks, he was ready to fight for it. Bradley started his days early, poring over training materials on bias, justice, and community policing. He reached out to civil rights organizations, trying to learn from those who had been fighting for change long before him. He sought therapy, confronting his own biases and the fears that had driven him to make that fateful decision in the parking lot. It was grueling, humbling work. There were moments when Bradley wanted to quit, moments when the weight of his past mistakes seemed too much to bear. But he pressed on. He knew that this was the only way to prove to the department, to his community, and to himself that he could change. Days turned into weeks, and Bradley's efforts began to make a difference. He attended town halls and community forums, listening to people speak about their experiences with law enforcement. Some people yelled at him, some ignored him, but a few gave him a chance to show that he was genuinely trying to understand their pain. He wasn't perfect, but he was listening. The moment of reckoning finally arrived. The hearing room was the same, but this time, Bradley walked in with a sense of purpose. He was no longer the man who had arrogantly assumed the power to belittle and control. He was a man who had spent the past month fighting for redemption, ready to face the consequences of his actions. Turner was there, his stern face unchanging. "Officer Monroe, you've had time to reflect on your actions. Tell us, why should we believe that you've truly changed?" Bradley stood tall, his heart steady. "I can't undo what I did, but I can promise you that I've learned from it. I understand now that the badge I wear isn't a symbol of power over others. It's a responsibility. I failed in that responsibility, and I am committed to making amends. I've done the work, I'm still doing the work, and I will continue to do so for as long as I wear this uniform." A heavy silence hung in the room. Then Turner nodded slowly. "We've reviewed your efforts, Officer Monroe. It's clear that you've taken significant steps toward redemption, but we can't overlook the seriousness of your actions." Bradley's stomach tightened, but he didn't flinch. "In light of your commitment and the work you've done to address your biases, we've decided to allow you to remain on the force." Bradley exhaled sharply, a rush of relief flooding through him. "You've been given a second chance," Turner continued. "But make no mistake, you will be held accountable every step of the way. This is not the end of your journey, Officer Monroe. It's just the beginning." Bradley nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you. I won't let you down." As he left the room, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He knew he had a long road ahead, but for the first time in months he felt a sense of purpose returning. He wasn't the man he had been before, but maybe, just maybe, he could become the man he had always hoped to be. And that journey, his journey, had only just begun. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Let's continue the conversation about bias, redemption, and change in our communities. What do you think? Can people truly change? And how can we hold ourselves accountable in the face of our mistakes? Subscribe to stay updated on more stories of justice, transformation, and personal growth. We're just getting started. Join the movement, because change starts with us.